My name is Patrick McNeil, also known as McMeeple, if you are on the Game Crafter chat at all. So I'm here, of course, today to talk about graphic design as it relates to board game designers. And it's a topic that's come up a few times today, and hopefully I can live up to the much needed hype there. I will say people spend an entire career getting good at this. So, we have 1 hour here. So I early on, I think when I first envisioned this, I was like, oh, I'm really going to teach them like how to do graphic design the right way. And it's like, well, no, that's why you go to college for that. So instead, I sort of flipped this on its head. And what I want to do is it's still kind of a crash course, but we're going to hit all the high points. Look for the easy or quickest ways we can enhance the graphic design of our games. So what are the big things we can do to really elevate the design of our games? And so that's really what I want to focus on today. And it's something I'm honestly pretty excited about. Now, I will say, I feel called out because I have all kinds of background images of games, and I don't have credits at the end for those. So I apologize to the many designers who I am borrowing from, as it were. So there you go. So I know it's kind of feels sort of formulaic in a way, but just the idea of looking at a definition of what graphic design actually is seems like a great way to start, and it'll lead naturally into the types of things that we want to talk about. So of course, it's, as it says here, it's a form of visual communication that combines images, words, and ideas to convey information to an audience, especially to produce a specific effect. I think this is a great point to point out, or a great opportunity to point out, that graphic design is not the same as illustration or the actual artwork, right? So you might hire an illustrator or a painter or somebody to produce the artwork for the game, but then it's up to the graphic designer to take that, combine it with the words used in the game and all the mechanics and all the things to produce sort of the visual assets that you have, right? So this might be obvious, but it seems worth stating. What I really love about this definition, though, is that last little bit where it says, especially to produce a specific effect. And I think that effect is what really is sort of the meat of graphic design, is especially as a game design. So I came up with 3 effects that I think the graphic design should be sort of focused on, if you will. And this is the order of importance that I give them. I think it's pretty sound reasoning for this, but anyway, so the first is that it should communicate the rules of the game. I think most people think of graphic design as like, well, it's just going to make it pretty, right? It's just going to be nice looking or whatever. But the functionality is really the heart of it. Does it communicate the rules of the game so that players can play the game, understand the game, and maybe in some cases it can really take away some real heavy points of confusion or frustration in the game. Second would be the theme of the game. And I think that that's kind of an interesting idea, that somehow the way we lay out the text or the fonts we use and the colors and that sort of thing can ultimately play into the functionality of the design. And then finally, it should make it aesthetically pleasing. And that could almost be like a separate thing. Like it can do step 1 and 2, but also time. But I think it's really good just to clearly say, like, making it beautiful is not the point of graphic design, right? Some graphic designers might disagree with that, but it's the main goal here is that this thing communicates and functions, and so I think that's really good to keep in mind. So real briefly, I want to look at just sort of a quick example. So imagine you've got a set of mechanics or rules like this, not rules, but mechanics or data points, if you will. And imagine this is like a card, and you've got this prototype, and it's just in paper form, and it's got these data points on it, and you've tested your prototype, and it works with these like sort of functions, right? We've got a title and a cost for the card and all these things, and you've play tested it, and it works really great. But now you need to like make it into something. So then in terms of graphic design, we can start to do things like add fonts that might start to reflect the theme of the game. In this case, you can see it's not the most thematic font, but it's really functional in the game. And then there's this whole concept of typography, which is like a whole subset of skills inside of graphic design, where we start to establish things like the hierarchy of the content. And you can see there's sort of 2 levels of content here. And of course, we're going to add some artwork to reinforce the theme and even the function of the game. And combine all that in an actual layout, and you get something kind of like this, right? We should add a contest to see who could like guess the game first. I don't know. Could anybody guess it just from the text? There you go. That's awesome. So this is actually an example I'll come back to a few times, because it's kind of one of those things where it's like the more you look at it as it from a graphic design standpoint, it functions so phenomenally well. It's a great game, and it's fun. So, it kind of wins on all fronts. And of course, all of this stuff is used to communicate the rules of the game. These things aren't just there to be beautiful. You might even think like, oh, well, the artwork's just there to be pretty. But it's actually really, really functional at the same time. And he forgot his coat, so
I forgot my coat,
he's going to grab it.
And another thing.
Don't put your game on the side.
Hire a graphic designer.
Right? Well, there we go. All right. So again, quick introduction. I'm Patrick. I'm a UX architect. I don't know if people know what the world of user experience design is, but that's what I do for a living. I design software based on how people use computers and whatnot. And so designing board games is sort of closely related to that. And I throw my game up there that I'm working on, Baked. You might have heard about it if you run around the Game Crafter at all. You can find me on mcmeeple.com. You can find me on Instagram and email me, of course, if you are so inclined. All right, so real briefly, the agenda for today, we're going to go through 5 main topics: fonts, typography, color, icons, and my favorite section, honestly, which is this whole idea of elegance by design. And of course, that's a lot to cover in an hour. So I think we'll probably cover fonts for the most time out of all this, which is not really what I anticipated when I dived into this, but that's where I went. And then I do always like to mention at the end of the presentation, there'll be a URL where you can download all this. So if you don't want to like write down some of the things, I don't know. It's late in the day. We're all getting tired. So if you don't, just sit back and act like you're interested, right? I was searching for just the right words, and I think the wrong words came out there, but that's all right. So the first thing is this notion of font selection. And has anybody tried to pair fonts or pick fonts? Like, anybody find this to be the easiest task they've ever done? No, it's like a total pain in the butt, right? It's really, really hard. And I'll tell you, it's even hard for designers. And it's actually really hard to even teach people how to freaking do it. There's so much sort of intuition and subtlety to it that it's like, man, there's not really any rules. It's just like sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And so I'm really going to try to kind of guide you into some, not principles for pairing fonts, but for kind of to really dissect how we use fonts. And this sort of comes down to 3 main sections. The first is logos on actual components, and then in the rule books. So there's sort of 3 sections that we'll look at. And so we'll go through each of these. And the first is just for game logos, right? And so you can see here I've got some notes, of course, and typically we use what we call a decorative font. And I will tell you, in the world of graphic design, if you go to like a highfalutin design agency, they're going to look at fonts like this and just think they're the stupidest, junkiest things in the world, right? This is not considered sort of high design, if you will. But in the world of like game design or toy design and those kinds of things, these types of fonts are like insanely evocative of a sort of a theme. So I was thinking about the Game Crafters Escape Room contest. So I went off to a font site and I just typed in the word escape. Just see what I come up with. And I think like this one in the top left, it's just like, it is literally oozing with like theme. You can just like imagine sort of thematic games just around that one font. And that's the kind of font I think works really well for a logo for a game design. And it should be stated very clearly, fonts like this are not intended to be used in any text in your game other than the logo, right? Don't set titles in it. Don't put your body copy in your rule book in this, because people will hate you for it, right? And so if you think I'm crazy, we can find lots of examples of games where they've used fonts that are just completely ridiculous to great effect, right? These are all really popular games. I mean, not popular, but they've done really well. And you can see they've got these like insane fonts that you would never use anywhere else. So it's a completely legitimate route to go. And that would be my main suggestion for that. Now, one of my favorite sources, there's literally hundreds of sources for this type of thing. Dafont, dafont.com, has always been one of my go-to places. And the reason for this is I just know their categories kind of well, because I've gone there so often. You'll find the same fonts show up everywhere. So just pick a source you like and go there. And obviously the big key here is that you can enter your text and like preview it, right? And I'll tell you, man, when I'm trying to pick a font for a logo, I'll spend hours scrolling through and looking for just the right one that really fits the theme and the feel of the game. I'd plugged in Gloomhaven for some random reason. I wasn't designing a logo for Gloomhaven. I don't know what I was thinking there. All right, so this next step is, this is a little bit outside the world of like picking a font, and this is more about like kind of making a logo, but it's one of my favorite sort of tricks, if you will, that I use just constantly, right? Every time I want to design a game, I'm almost thinking this first, because it's like, to me, it's the most fun part. But if you Google this term, Photoshop text effects, there's this like whole world of pre-made styles for text in Photoshop. It's absolutely crazy. So this is an example right here, this text Gladius. And this is pulled from a tutorial where they show you how to take text that looks like just regular black text and turn it into this sort of semi-three-dimensional, glossy, golden, beautiful thing that would be totally at home on the cover of a game that's like related to like Roman gladiators or something, right? And the great thing is they not only show you how to do it, but you can put in any text you want, and you can use, you know, whatever font you want typically, depends on the tutorial that you're looking at. And so that's one example. And there's literally just like dozens of these things for all kinds of insane types of styles that you might want, right? This last one's my favorite, Galaxy. I don't know, I just like want to make a game that uses that as the logo just because for some reason it appeals to me. It's like one of those crazy things. Now, one thing I will mention, especially in the light of talking about Illustrator this morning, which you have to be careful with, is that these tend to be pixel-based, right? It's not going to be vector. So if you're going to make one of these things, have a cool ringtone to start with, and then make it really, really big. Because if you make it small on accident, and then later you've got to size it up, you're going to be like, oh, this is awful. So make sure you make it really large, and that's always a good thing. So again, in case you think I'm totally nuts, these are a few games plucked from the top 10 on Board Game Geek, just to prove a point. That Gloomhaven text is absolutely gorgeous, but it is like completely insanely styled, right? Somebody went to town in Photoshop with like all kinds of effects on this sucker, and it's gorgeous. And I think it's just true. You'll see it all over the place. So it's really kind of a way to create a logo without having to go through the pains of making a logo, if you will. I don't know how to describe it. It's a real nice shortcut. And so here's a few quick examples of places where I did this. So my game Baked is about, you know, baking donuts and cupcakes and stuff, right? So I found this example, and I might change my logo to that just because it's so much fun. But I did steal that style and make this nice little clover leaf to go with my made-up game company called McNeil Games, which exists nowhere except in my head. But still, it's got an awesome little badge, and it, like, you know, it goes on my box and it looks great. But the point is I was able to like create this thing that I otherwise would have never been able to do that, right? I wouldn't have necessarily known the steps to go through, and it turned out real quick and simple. Another game I'm working on, we all have mini games that we play with, and I skipped right to making a logo for it because, of course, that's the first thing you do when you're designing a game. And I found this type style that was just like, man, it looks awesome, right? So for me personally, once I do that, like it gives me like a visual for the game, and that really, it just works for me, right? It just resonates for me. And so I changed the colors a little bit. It was more of a like a burgundy red. I wanted kind of a brighter red, but I just loved it. I'm like, man, this is like so insane, but it works really, really well. And so just to drive this point home, that there's like an absurd quantity of options in this regard. This is, have you guys seen the Envato marketplaces? You can buy like website templates or sound loops. You can buy pretty much any digital asset you can buy there. Well, they've got this subcategory called Photoshop Styles, and that's because of the way you apply these in Photoshop. It's got like over 4,600 of these suckers. And the commercial ones are even kind of better because somebody's like taking the time to make it a commercial product. We're talking like $3, $4, $5 a piece. I'd pay that all day long for a radical shortcut to a really nice looking logo. So that's my big tip for making an awesome logo out of almost nothing. So as it relates to logos and picking fonts, kind of a pro tip here is don't reuse the font from your logo anywhere else in your game, right? It's just kind of like, I almost want to say just trust me and don't do it, and that's really kind of the amount of it, right? Like that's just kind of the way you do it. You just don't reuse your logo font. And the primary reason, I suppose, is because it cheapens the logo. If you use that font elsewhere in your text and whatever, then it kind of it starts to feel like it's not really a logo anymore. It's just kind of just like other text, right? So you really want it to be able to stand out on its own. And so these are a few of the components from Gloomhaven. And you can see like where it says Cragheart. It's still a really like sort of decorative typeface that's kind of got it fits the theme and the feel, but it's not the same typeface, right? It goes together and it works well, but they didn't reuse that logo anywhere. or they didn't reuse that font anywhere else in their game. So yes, it means you have to pick yet another font, which is kind of painful, but it is well worth it. All right, so that's enough harping on logos. So second up is this idea of fonts for game components. And so there we see sort of two primary usages. And this is, anybody ever play or used to play World of Warcraft trading card game? That was my obsession for a long time. I don't know why. I just loved it. Anyway, so I like to pull examples when I can of that game. So anyway, so this is the card from there. And of course, it's got a title text, right? And it's got a bit of body text. And when you especially look at the body text up close, you're like, well, that's like kind of bland, right? It's incredibly functional. So let's dig into both of these real quickly. First is this sort of title. And again, I got the title from that card there. You'll notice, of course, that it's maybe slightly thematic. It doesn't feel like it's beating the World of Warcraft theme over the head, right? It's kind of, you know, it's got the fancy little decorations on it. So it's kind of thematic-ish, right? Especially when it's paired with the logo and the world. You get the feel for it, right? But it's much more functional. It's not intended to be like incredibly decorative. We're talking, this is going to be the text on the top of every card. It's got to be sort of functional. You got to be able to read it. You will find sometimes that like title text on like cards or artifacts is the same font that is used as the subtitle text in a game. And we'll see this later on where the logo has like a main logo and it's got kind of a subtext, and the font from that subtext is then used elsewhere. And that's a perfectly reasonable approach. This is a great point to talk about kind of maybe an overlooked sort of opportunity, and that is this idea of condensed fonts. So a friend of mine helps me name things. He gives the best names. I text him a picture of like a character and he sends me the most ridiculous names. It's great. It's like a chat bot for cool names. So Boom Boom Bigglesworth. And I like that one in this case because it's really, really long, and like, you know, that would drive a designer nuts trying to fit that on a card. And so you can see I set it in two different typefaces. One is wider than the other. And the one on the right is simply using something called a condensed font, right? It's intended to be narrow so that you can fit more text in a small amount of space. So it's a small but significant detail. And I'll actually show you a great source for getting condensed fonts here in a little bit. One thing I mentioned there, you definitely need to avoid overly decorative fonts because you don't want to keep people from reading it, right? It's got to be functional at this point. So they got to be able to read the darn stuff, right? Have you ever played a game where you're just like, man, this text is so frustrating, I can't read it. It's so much work to read the text. I should have saved an example, but that's all right. All right, so next up is this the supporting text we found on that card. And as you can see here, it's kind of a basic font, right? It's nothing really dramatic. And that's okay because everything else around this card is like just dripping with theme, right? So we get it. We don't need it beat over our head. This is functional text. That's a lot of text to read. So you want it to be really readable. It's got to be easy to sort of scan and whatnot. So you just want to use a more normal font. And a lot of times that same font, you're going to find it in the rule book. So it's going to be a nice bit of crossover there for you. All right, so the third and sort of final usage, although there's probably others that we haven't thought of, is when we're picking fonts for our rule book. And again, we have sort of two things. We have the titles and the body copy, much like the cards. What we'll notice here is actually, I think this is from Gloomhaven. And I like this example because in the bottom right, we see one of the cards from the game where it's got the word trample. It's the same font, right? They've sort of reused that font, and that's totally great. That's fine. As Dustin mentioned earlier, I love how they've really called out the hierarchy of this, and I've got some better examples of that later on. But the real point is that there's sort of two types of text here, right? There's the titles, which have sort of a more decorative font, versus the body copy, right? When I open up the rule book for Gloomhaven, honestly, I was a little surprised to just find this sort of generic sans serif font. I thought it might be something maybe a little more thematic, but it's not. It's just like really functional. And that's really the most important approach to take when it comes to the rules, because it's a lot of freaking words to read, right? I mean, I guess that sounds silly to say, but you know, I think we get carried away sometimes with using really decorative fonts in places where it should be functional and not necessarily decorative, right? It's just got to be able to read it. So this is a great chance to reuse fonts in your rule book. Definitely don't hesitate to add another rule or another font. Maybe you didn't need that basic font on your components. because there was no text or something. But don't hesitate to add that in, because it's okay to have an extra font there. And then I kept going back and forth on this back one. Like, should we default to a basic serif font for the book, or should we default to a sans serif, right? Either way, just a basic, I don't want to say like Times Roman and Arial, but if you had to, like, it's okay to default to those, right? I'm going to show you a better source than those, but that's the kind of idea we're talking about, just a really simple and functional font. This is the example I was talking about earlier. So Arkham Horror has this nice font they used for the logo, and then they've got the subtext that says the card game. And you'll see that same font used then in the headlines inside of the book, right? So there's a nice crossover. They're reusing the font. It's strategic. It ties things together. But then the body copy is just set in a plain old, easy to read font. We'll circle back to some points on hierarchy and typography in the next section. All right, so one of my absolute favorite tricks, and I think if you haven't embraced this idea, you will absolutely love it. It's the idea of using a font set. Has anybody used like a font set before? Right? So basically what it is this is, it's called Helvetica Neue, and I have a love affair with Helvetica Neue for personal reasons, but it's on the internet. I have a way of saying awkward things. I don't know what it is. It always happens, no matter what. My first book was set in Helvetica Neue, and since then I love it, of course. So this is the quote-unquote normal size for Helvetica Neue, and you can see here it comes in 8 different visual weights. So normal is referring to the width of the font. And this font actually comes in a condensed version. So it's like got all those same weights, but they're compressed horizontally. And note that this doesn't mean that the text is put into like Photoshop and then squished, right? Don't go squishing text, like big no-no, okay? Use a condensed font. Don't condense your font manually. So anyway, so it comes in a condensed weight here, or width. It also actually comes in extended. I've honestly never used extended in this particular typeface. And then even less used is this outline. I guess if you really need outline Helvetica Neue, it's there. So you have this matrix of widths and weight, right? And so you can have 3 different widths or 8 different weights. That's a lot of fonts, right? I'm actually pretty sure Helvetica Neue used to come with the Adobe suite. I don't know if it does anymore. So anyway, so out of this set, what you do is you don't like use all of them, right? You don't want to use all 24 different of these. You pick like a subset. And so what I usually do is I'll pick something like the normal Roman one for body text, for example, and then I'll use the condensed black or heavy for titles or headings or section titles. So you've got that nice sort of heavy visual contrast, and then I'll pick out like the condensed light one or something for captions or sort of side elements. And the reason I show you this is because when you use fonts from the same family like this, they go together. Like, you don't have to wonder if they'll match each other. They match each other by design. They're made to be used together. And so if you take these combined with sort of another decorative font like we found earlier, you'll have just a great system that you can use throughout your game. So it's a great shortcut to jump right to doing something like that. And so this is a little snippet from my rule book for Baked. And you can see where I've got 3 different fonts in here, or 3 different weights of Helvetica Neue. And this is the Roman normal width, the bold, and then this is like the condensed heavy. I don't think it's all the way to their heaviest one called black. And so it's just a real simple system. I've got 3 of them. I didn't have to think too hard about it because they all go together, and I keep using that same thing over and over and over again, right? Because it's a workhorse. It works really well. So one of the caveats to this is that font sets can be really expensive, right? Fonts are not cheap. If you've ever bought a font set, then you probably work someplace that's pretty heavy into design. I've never bought one because they're freaking expensive. So this is Google Fonts, and it's a great place to go for really functional fonts. People think of it as a place for fonts on the web, but you can download all these and use them offline in printed stuff, and I'm like 99.9% sure their license is pretty much whatever you want to do with them. You can use them anywhere. And I show you this.
I'm going to just caveat that because I've looked into that.
Have you?
Some are commercial and some aren't. You have to read it.
You have to double check.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. All right, so the key here I really want you to see is this option right here where you can check to say filter this by fonts based on the number of styles. So that's checked and it's slid up to 10 plus. And so it's only showing us font families that have at least 10 different styles. And so like this one has 10 different styles in it. And that's going to be, like we just saw, probably some version of light all the way up to heavy and maybe some condensed fonts. This one has 18 different ones. You can actually see out of their 843 different font families, 35 of them have 10 or more different weights. So I'm pretty sure you'll be able to find something you're going to like in there and be able to use the crap out of it in your designs. All right, so just to recap, because this is a lot of font picking here, right? This is a whole lot of action going on. So to sum up, this is my formula, this is my approach. I'll find a really, really decorative font to use for the logo. I'll find something that's maybe slightly decorative, but much more functional for titles or large text, like section titles in the rule book or titles on cards, that type of thing. Then I'll definitely find a non-decorative font to use in the components, and quite often that will be the same font that I use in the actual rule book. And then of course, like we've just been saying, we'll find a font set for the rule book where we'll have 2 to 3 variants of the same font, such as a condensed heavy font for the section titles, a regular weight font for the main text, and a lighter font for low priority text like captions or side text and that type of thing. And we kind of hinted at this already, but font licenses are a real thing. So pay attention to what you're doing. Of course, we're kind of operating in this sort of indie game world where, maybe we blur those lines at times, but it's a good thing to be aware of that you might run into later on. Whew. So that's a lot about fonts, much more than I anticipated talking about. But apparently I had a lot to say about that. All right, so next up is this idea of typography. And there's kind of the teacher and the designer in me is kind of pained by the idea of talking about typography in 5 minutes or less. It's just kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, you laugh, but it's kind of absurd, right? So typography is definitely this subset of graphic design. And here's another definition for you. It's the art of arranging type to make written language legible, readable, and appealing when displayed. So it's all about the way type is set on a page, right? It's a difficult beast to wrangle. It's subtle, it's challenging, and I taught in a university where we taught graphic design, and the classes that were considered the hardest or the most challenging that exposed the best designers of the students was always the typography classes, right? It is not easy, it is very difficult, and 99.9% of it comes down to consistency, which sounds like it should be easy, but it's not. It's really, really hard. In fact, I have a sample in here of a spread from my rule book, and while I was reviewing my slides before, I'm like, dang it, I found inconsistencies, and I had to go back and fix them, but it's in the slides, so what are you going to do? So consistency in things like font usage, sizing, spacing, alignment, and color, all of these things, you have to nail those down across the board. Because if you have it kind of sloppy where, well, sometimes my titles are this size and sometimes they're this size, or maybe you have cards and sometimes the title of your card is really short and sometimes it's really long. So when it's really long, you make it a smaller font, right? Well, all of a sudden you've got an inconsistency there that's just going to be sort of visually distracting, and it will cheapen the design of your game. It will feel cheaper. You won't understand why, people won't understand why, but it'll just kind of feel sloppy, right? And so that consistency is probably the most significant thing that you can do. And like I say down there at the bottom, he showed us how in Word, you pick the heading 1 or the heading 2 or the heading 3. It's the same kind of thing. You want to define those rules for how they work, meaning what's the spacing like around those heading 1s or heading 2s? What's the color of them? Which weight of the font are they? And that kind of thing. So that it's 100% sort of applied the same way throughout your document. So here's that rule book we looked at briefly earlier. And I want to just touch on this topic of hierarchy. We heard this mentioned earlier. And of course, the hierarchy is sort of creates these chunks of content, right, that we can scan. And you can see here, the designer wasn't really subtle about creating these sort of headlines. I mean, the headline is twice as tall as that, right? I see a lot of times where people feel like, I'll just use the same font for my heading, but I'll make it bold. And it's like, no, man, just like make it big and chunky so that I can scan it real easy. And you might say, and Dustin might say, that these are almost too close in size, but maybe there's a significant enough difference between those. But you can see this is like a big section and this is like a small section within it. So the point is, don't be subtle, right? One of the kind of funny tips about graphic design is like, when in doubt, like make it bigger or much bigger, like make things humongous. And then you're like, oh wow, it actually works really well. So make those things really large. And that's where that condensed font can come in handy, because if it's a condensed font, it means it takes up less space horizontally and you can increase its size so it can be much larger. Another small detail when it comes to typography is line length. And this is something people probably don't think about a whole lot. A good rule of thumb is that a line of text in your document shouldn't be longer than 2 alphabets. So you just type the alphabet twice, and it shouldn't be longer than that. So in Microsoft Word, maybe at a small, like 12 point or whatever size, you know, your line of text is going to be much longer than 2 alphabets. And it's actually, there's all kinds of research that shows it's exhausting when you like read and the line's too long. You kind of start to lose track of where you are, and then you've got to like track back to the other side. It distracts you from reading the content. So it's actually really important to make sure that you're breaking things down. And that's why we get these columns like you see down here. And I would actually say, so this is from Firefly the game, and this is from that Arkham Horror game. This one, to me, the bottom one feels like a better width. I'm not sure why they went 3 columns on this one, because it's fairly narrow columns. But anyway, so that's why you see the use of columns in text, and it's a great rule to follow. So a good rule of thumb for you.
Question.
Yes?
On this about 50 characters per line, is that applied to all forms of communication? I mean, I'm picturing like when I read a book. I mean, there's a lot more than 50 characters per line. So does this only apply to what we're doing here, writing rules?
It's a general rule that so the question was, does this 50 character rule apply to like text in all forms everywhere? And I'd say, of course not, no. There's like going to be exceptions to that, but if you notice like novels, like paperback novels, they're not real wide, right? They're sort of fixed to a certain size, and part of that comes down to the readability of being able to scan through and blast through those lines. I would say in rule books, it pretty much always applies. Now, if you have like cards in your game, you're going to be hard pressed to even get 2 alphabets. I'm saying that's like kind of a maximum, right? It's sort of an ideal width that would work well for rule books, but there's going to be like on a playing cards or something, you know, obviously it's going to be a lot less than that, which is totally fine. It's really more the problem comes in when they get too long. That's typically what happens. It's like you end up with huge long lines that are just really hard to read. All right, so another kind of nitpicky point, and if you're a designer and you're into typography, like this idea of sort of taking care of widows and orphans, it's like a satisfying sort of bug squashing experience, right? If you're not a designer, it's like, oh, seriously? I got to worry about 1 word on a line? Like, are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. So the whole idea is that you want to eliminate situations where you have a single word on a line, or even worse, you have the last line of a paragraph wrapping over to the next column, right? And it seems like such a sort of stupid thing to worry about, but once you get rid of those, it's really hard to say how like it just elevates the quality of the design. It really, really does enhance the design. And this is this spread, I guess they're not facing pages, but 2 pages from a rule book for my game. And I wanted to point out, like, this isn't easy. Like, I've got an orphan. I don't have any widows, but I also noticed, this is the other thing, and this is like this is a great illustration of how OCD typography is and how it really sort of enhances a design. The spacing here between these 2 paragraphs, that's not the right freaking spacing. What's the matter with me? It's supposed to be like that, right? I don't know what's going on. I must have had a title in there or something, who knows? But, so here's the other thing that relates to sort of this idea of widows. If you look at this sort of section, this page right here, I had to break this up, unfortunately, right? And I tried so hard to figure out a way to get that to fit up there, and it just wouldn't work. Whereas if you look over here, I have sort of 4 big sections here, the recipes, the tiny one, this one that goes there, and then the last one. man, there's no way to like configure those because there's 3 big sections and 2 columns. I had to break something up. So I worked really hard to make sure that like the paragraph was on its own versus all of the little callouts over there together, right? So just trying to group those things, and it just gives it a finished sort of quality, right? It just feels a little bit better. And so you'll notice, I know I harped on the idea of consistency, but you can see like this text goes farther down in the page than this text, right? So there's a little bit of wiggle room there. In this case, for the sake of making sure that like game in didn't have to go on the next page with some other goofy content that it didn't make sense with. Because this one is actually has a facing page and it shows step 1, step 2, how the game ends. So it's like the whole thing of how to play the game in one spread. And so that was why I sort of cheated my own system here and made the text go a little farther down. So part of this really does come down to sort of that obsession over all those tiny details. Another great sort of place to obsess is how we group our headings with our text, right? Yes?
Question on your last slide.
You bet.
Speaking of obsessions, for me at least. How about left justified and right justified for double columns?
Oh, so like justifying columns, like full justify left and right?
Yeah, so it goes flat to the right.
You know, there's the biggest problem you run into once you do that, all this space that you see here gets spread out inside of your text, and you end up with these sort of swim lines kind of through it. It looks kind of janky. Left align. If you're right aligning your text, there should be like a really spectacular reason for that, because most likely you don't need to right align. This is incidentally another reason why you want your line length to be a certain width, is that the rag along the left starts to look nicer more naturally if the lines are long enough. If you have really sort of a narrow column, this rag on the side just gets crazy because it's having to wrap a lot of words. You know, there's some people would definitely say never justify both sides. I know when I was a teacher in design school, it was basically like, you're not allowed to do it. It's like using Comic Sans, like you're just not allowed to do it. But, you know, it is what it is. I'd say there's probably not a real good reason to. I don't think it's necessary in most cases. All right, so onward and upward. So grouping headings with content. And you can see here, this is actually the default styles in Microsoft Word, where this is a heading 1 and this is text that falls under it. I had to intentionally make it look really stupid like you see it over there. And in fact, if you come back to this example, you'll notice I've intentionally grouped the headings with the content below it so that there's a singular space separating them. If this heading was sort of centered between there, you'd have sort of space on both sides, and it just creates more visual elements. Even though it's dead space, it creates more visual elements to sort of make the design look busier. So by clustering them together, it creates a nice group that's sort of like, you get it. This chunk, that's like a chunk of content. You can just tell by looking at it, right? You don't have to think about it. So if you space those things out inappropriately or in the middle, then it really starts to screw with the design. So it's kind of one of those details that if you're using Word or something like that, it maybe does it automatically. But once you get into a tool like InDesign or some of their page layout software, it may not do that automatically, but it's a really, really good detail to pay attention to. All right, and I hope you're ready for it. I have another stolen game design here because it was appropriate for the colors section. Yeah, I hear it's really good. Yes.
Luckily, you've written the rule book, and I see that. So it's a good question.
Lucky.
You know, so you first come up with a game, you write your rules, and you just smatter it on something, no matter where you write it.
Right.
At what point did you find yourself saying, okay, now I'm going to put it in this nice-looking spot, and then at that point you start messing with your rules just so that it doesn't have orphans, it doesn't have, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's a tricky business because you carefully write your rules to make freaking sense, and then all of a sudden you're telling me I got to start changing stuff to get rid of a word. Like, I put those words there for a reason. What are you telling me to take them out? You know, me being totally backwards, I started in InDesign, so which is not the way to do it because it doesn't have like spelling and grammar. It's terrible for that, right? I don't know. I just did it. Like, it was kind of a dumb choice. But you're right. What was the question in there? What was it? When do you do that?
Problem I run into
I got distracted.
I'm writing my rules, playtest a couple times, I think.
Oh yeah.
And then I'm like, okay, I'm gonna make it awesome, right? And then
Okay,
that,
got it.
Right? And then I gotta like.
Yeah, so how do you balance massaging the design without breaking the rules? You know, it's just a delicate line. You gotta walk it, and you find like sometimes that challenge is good. You're like, you know, I was a little wordy there, so I can cut out some words, and it's okay. And in other cases, you're like, I really got to kind of bend the rules of my visual design, or maybe I got to add some words or force in a line break sometimes. So there's just different tips or tricks you can do. Some people, I hesitate to even say this, you do things like they'll take a paragraph of text and enhance the spacing between the letters throughout the paragraph in a really, really tiny way to where it should not be perceivable, but then that can help sometimes just like bump an extra word down. In the most recent book I just finished, we had, oh my gosh, we spent many, many late nights going through the book, changing the freaking text so that we would eliminate all these orphans. And it was a lot of work, but it really pays off in the end. So when to do it, it's just kind of a part of the puzzle. It's just a part of it. I don't know what else to say about it. There's no easy way to solve it. Probably not the greatest answer, but that's what I've got at the moment for you. All right, so this notion of colors, let's dive in there because we've got a little ways to go and we've got about 15 minutes, 20 minutes to do it. So the basic thing with color is, and we maybe know this already, but colors have meaning, right? There's sort of communicate something. And of all the things that go into our design, the color probably has the most powerful sort of emotional connection of anything in the design, right? Besides the artwork, but the artwork consists of color. So color is like, you know, it is a huge element and it's something really important to think about. And I think this is the kind of, for me, is a fun little example of this. So on the left, we have Descent, which we all know is this very serious, long game. And you can see the colors are dark and sort of serious. On the right, we have Dragon Slayer. And it is a fast 15-minute game, and it uses these sort of bright, energetic colors. We expect something different from the game on the right versus the game on the left just because of the colors. We could have cropped out the name of the game, and you would have been able to describe to me the type of game that you're about to embark on, right? We don't expect the one on the right to be a 2-hour epic journey. The one on the left, it might take you, 4 months to finish a game of it, right? I started a game of Descent once. I made it halfway through the first level in like one night and never finished it, but that's a whole nother story. So the point is choose your colors carefully. I've got a little bit more on how to pick some colors, but before we dive into that, I want to talk about this idea of color unity. I don't really know of a term for it, so I kind of made up the term color unity. If you look at the picture on the left, we can clearly tell a child made this painting, right? Probably not for the reason that I'm going to describe, and that is that each color is like, we have green here, we have brown here, we have red here, we have blue here. It's a very sort of basic way of viewing the world. Compare that to this painting on the right, which is a very famous painting by I think he was Dutch, a Dutch master. The yellow shirt down at the bottom, like it's yellow, but it's got blue throughout it, right? It's like, well, what's blue doing on my yellow shirt? It doesn't make any sense. This is one of the basic things you learn in painting classes in college, is like you want the colors to be unified throughout the piece. Even though you're like, it's a blue turban, she's got, whatever peach color skin and a yellow shirt. The shirt should be yellow, skin should be peach, the hat should be blue. They shouldn't cross over, right? But that's not the way it works. If you look closely at it, there's blue and yellow throughout the entire piece, and it pulls the whole thing together in this beautiful way. And so if we look at an example from the gaming world, this is Firefly. And you can tell, if you just look at it from a color standpoint, the whole thing is just this nice, tight, cohesive system, right? There's a ton of color used, but it all works together. All of the elements feel like they go together. And so I think that should be sort of your ambition when you set out to use color in your design. Put all the things in front of you together. Do they look like they go together? Is the color, are you reusing colors throughout each piece so that they are tightly bound together? One of the most powerful ways to do this is to build a color palette, right? To build a fixed set of colors that you want to use throughout your design. Number one rule of this, don't use the default red, blue, and yellow and green. You can have red, blue, yellow, and green in your game, but don't make them be like the default red that comes with Microsoft Paint, right? It just feels cheap, it looks generic. It's just like we all recognize it. You can have the same 4 colors in some sort of other variation. And I'll show you how to really sort of jumpstart that here in a second. I've already harped on this, but build a palette that you're going to use throughout your design. even configure it in like a Photoshop or something where you've literally got the squares with the colors. So you've got like a system for how you're going to do this. So out on the interwebs, there's lots of websites that do things like share color palettes, right? This is an Adobe site. It's free. You don't have to be an Adobe customer to use it. But these sites have just literally tens of thousands of color palettes pre-made for you, right? So I went here and I typed in the word zombie. I'm like, what if I'm making a zombie game, right? And so he pops up with all these lovely color palettes that I could use. I mean, you could see everything from like really dark and serious games to the one at the bottom middle, which is like this pink and green, to being like kind of a, you know, a silly Plants vs. Zombies kind of a thing, right? The point is this is a great way to jumpstart it, so you don't have to really, again, this is kind of like picking fonts that go together. Building a color palette can be really difficult. And this can be a great way to really jumpstart that and get right to a useful solution. Now I will say, whenever I've used a set like this, I don't use it like verbatim. Like, I mean, I do and I don't. What I mean is that it's not like it's a rule, you can't change it, right? Like I always add other colors to it. Like even if I'm using this crazy bright one down here, I'll probably add like a dark gray or a black to it for, you know, text and stuff like that. So don't feel like you got to get totally carried away with it, but it definitely gives you a huge jump start so that you don't necessarily have to sort of figure it out, right? All right, so we have two more sections to get through. Icons is sadly a relatively short section, but we will cover a few things here nonetheless. The main thing I want to say about icons is that the entire point of using an icon in a game is that it should make the game something easier or faster for the player. If it doesn't make it easier or faster for the player, you should not be using it, right? We do see some games that will try to use icons excessively for the purpose of internationalization. They don't want to have to print the game in multiple languages. So let's make everything an icon. And it can result in a game that's rather difficult to use. Now, since this is supposed to make things easier and faster for the player, we ought to play test them, right? As people play your game, you can do things like say, what do you think this icon means, right? What do you expect to happen when you use this sort of function? And if people consistently can't get it right, then maybe you just need to write the freaking words on the card or something, right? I mean, it seems so obvious, but it's sort of, it is what it is. All right, so in terms of rules of engagement, like how can I use icons or when can I use them? The number one thing you can do is if you've got elements that are used throughout the entire game, they're on every card, whatever, great chance to use an icon. Players will quickly learn what it means, what its function is, and why, you know, what that little symbol stands for. In fact, it can be really useful if you think about games like Magic the Gathering, where we have the different mana types, and they've got a symbol for each of those, right? That's actually incredibly functional when you think about building a deck and you're just going through thousands of cards, looking at cards, and you've got this one symbol. You know, if I find that symbol, I can use it. It becomes this great point of sort of functionality, right? And those are something that's used throughout the game. And in that case, it's used, it's been used for decades now across countless sets of cards. Another way that icons can be used really effectively is sort of as a supporting element. And like we think about that coin in the game Hero Realms, where it's a coin behind the number, right? It becomes sort of this visual element that reinforces a data point, and that's really a great usage. So if you want kind of a rule to follow, a great one is to use no more than 7 plus or minus 2 icons. And this is really sounds like a vague way of establishing a rule, but the idea here is that this relates back to research about human memory and our ability to remember a certain number of things, right? And the reason it's 7 plus or minus is because if you've got really simple things that maybe relate to functions like attack and defense and health that people like naturally remember because it's been like in every game ever, then you can have maybe more of them. But if each icon represents something a little more complicated, then you're going to probably want to dial it back. So let's look at, I think I have 2 or 3 examples here. Here's that Hero Realms card. And I just want to point out, yes, they have icons for things like, you know, you exhaust the card to do this, or it costs 3 coins, or it has 3 defense. But notice they spelled out, draw a card. Do you think they couldn't dream up an icon for draw a card? Of course they could. They chose not to. All right, so I'm being flagged down. Yada, yada, yada. That's great graphic design. Just kidding, just kidding. All right, so we might know this game. It's like the poster child for what not to do with icons, right? I won't say the name because I haven't designed a game as good as that yet. Kingdom Builder, in my opinion, every time I play this, I have to really think hard about what these mean. I love this game, but would it have killed them to just put from the rule book? I mean, they've got like a simple statement for what each of these does. They could have put it on that component, and they didn't because they wanted to print one version of it and sell it in every country, right? You buy the game, you get it in 10 different languages. All right, sorry. I'm in crazy mode. All right, so my favorite section, which I will cover just a couple examples here because to me this is like the upper echelon of what happens when you really achieve great graphic design in a game. And it's this whole idea that the visuals can ultimately reinforce the rules, right? At times it can actually make the rules even harder to forget or miss because it kind of puts them in front of you in a way that is just really amazing, or you might say elegant, right? We start to think of elegant games, and it's usually because they've merged the design and the function or the rules of the game into this one beautiful thing. And do we all recognize this game, right? I don't know if you like noticed this, but when I played this the first time, I was just like struck by this notion that like I have this player card, all my things are on it, and they're covering up stuff. And when I take that stuff off there and put it on the board, not only does the thing on the board do something, but the space it left does something as well. To me, that's like just like very essence of what elegant design in a game can be. Because now, instead of the rule book saying, for every 3 of these you have out there, you get this, and for every other one of those, you have to do this. It's like, well, holy crap. I don't want to keep track of that. Hey, look at that. It's right there, right? All I have to do is look at it. It's intuitive. It's easy. It's just plain as day. Same thing with the powers under the mechs. You have 4 mechs. When you put a mech out there, you gain the power under it. If I recall right, that's the way the rules work. But the point is it's like, it's just natural. The 2 pieces go together perfectly. We see the same thing in Great Western Trail, where you have elements leaving your player board doing something and elements coming onto the player board, but they serve this sort of dual function. They have the function of what they are on the board, full combination of things. Personally, I attempted to do this sort of thing, and I hesitated to even show my game after those 2 slides because those are 2 spectacular games. In my game, you have this, you're putting cubes on your recipes to fill up your factory to make stuff. And at first it was just a number. You can put 3 on there, right? Hey, that's really confusing. I can't figure out how many I have left. I got to do math all the time. Just put a box there, right? And it's not the kind of thing like now it just feels like, well, duh, I did it that way, right? But when I think back and look at my prototypes early on, it was not nearly as clear or as sort of elegant. Shadows over Camelot. The entire game is built around this idea of beautiful visuals that just keep track of trackers, right? The whole thing can be boiled down to a little tiny map. But no, it's like this big lavish game, and the theme really shines through for that reason. All right, so obviously I get very excited about this. I will skip a few more examples of that. Really appreciate your time. If you go to, actually posted it on my site, mcmeeple.com, you can find all these slides there. And of course, there's my contact info. So enjoy your dinner, and thank you for coming.